4. Broad dimension of child and adolescent development. Third dimension, language and literacy development. Behaviorist theories. The author, John B. Watson. Behaviorism, also known as behavioral psychology, is a theory of learning based upon the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning. Conditioning occurs through interaction with the environment. Behaviorists believe that our responses to environmental stimuli shape our actions. And behaviorism refers to the school of psychology founded by John B. Watson based on the belief that behaviors can be measured, trained, and changed. The assumptions of behaviorism. Number 1. The primary means of investigating learning is by observation. Number 2. Principles of learning apply equally of different behaviors and to different species of animals. Number 3. Learning processes can be studied objectively. Typically, learning is described as a stimulus and response relationship. Equivalent S equal R. Number 4. Internal cognitive processes are largely excluded from a scientific study. Number 5. Learning involves a behavior change. Number 6. Organisms are born as blank sheets. Since each organism has a different experience with the environment, each will have a different set of behaviors. Number 7. Learning is largely the result of environment events. Behaviorists tend to use the term conditioning instead of learning to reflect this. And principles of learning from behaviorist theory. The principle of frequency and exercise. It states that the more frequently a given response is made to a given stimulus, the more likely the response to that stimulus will be repeated. Principle of recency. It states that the more recently a given response to a particular stimulus is made, the likely it will be repeated. And whatever we did last under a given set of circumstances will be what we will tend to do again if those circumstances are re-encountered. And the principles of effect, positive and negative reinforcement, consistency in the use of reinforcers during the teaching-learning process. And the John Brodus Watson. Little Albert experiment, father of American behaviorist theory or father of behaviorism. His work based on Pavlov experiments who had studied animals' responses to conditioning. He researched on classical conditioning. Watson believed that all individual differences in behavior were due to difference of learning. And John Watson proposed that the process of classical was able to explain all aspects of human psychology. Everything from speech to emotional responses were simply patterns of stimulus and response. And John Watson denied completely the existence of the mind or consciousness. There is the example of classical conditioning. Before conditioning, there is neutral stimulus to no response, and during conditioning, there is neutral stimulus to unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and after conditioning, neutral stimulus to conditioned response. There is a Watson experiment, and known as Little Albert, occurred in 1920, one of the most controversial experiments in the history of psychology. Watson was interested in taking Pavlov's research further to show that emotional reactions could be classically conditioned in people. The participant in the experiment was a child. A 9-month-old infant, Albert, was selected. He was tested and was judged to show no fear when excessively observing a number of 5 animals. So there is example of a kid. He tested that Ang bata kuno walay kahadlukan bisag imo pa ng pasakitan or paduolan og bisag unsa na hayop. So there is a stage 1 before conditioning. The boy initially showed no fear of any of the objects he was shown. So ang bata daw pag makakita kuno unsa daw ng mga butang, dili daw siya mahadlok. And the stage 2, during conditioning, the next time Albert was exposed the rat, Watson made a loud noise by hitting a metal pipe with a hammer. Si Watson kuno naghimo og saba pero nahadlok ang bata. So makita nato sa example na naadjay kahadlokan ang bata. And stage 3, after conditioning, naturally, the child began to cry after hearing the loud noise. So, pagkadungog na sa bata, sa angogog, ditoan na siya nagsugod og hilak. After repeatedly pairing to white rat with the loud noise, Albert began to cry simply after seeing a rat. So, nahilak man ang bata, nahilo man siya pagkakita sa rat. After several such pairings of the two stimuli, Albert was again presented with only the rat. Now, however, he became very distressed as the rat appeared in the room. He cried, turned away from the rat, and tried to move away. The experiment showed that little Albert seemed to generalize his response to foreign objects, so that when Watson sent a non-white rabbit into the room 17 days after the original experiment, Albert also became distressed. He showed similar reactions when presented with a furry dog and even when Watson appeared in front of him wearing a Santa Claus mask with white cotton balls as his beard. Later, another child, 3-year-old Peter, was experimented. Once the fear was well established, he brought the rabbit into the same room with the child while the child was eating, keeping enough distance between the rabbit and child so that the child was not alarmed. He then moved the rabbit closer and closer to the child, allowing him to grow accustomed to it in gradual steps. Eventually, the child was able to touch and hold the formerly fear-inducing animal. According to Watson, this procedure had eliminated fear by conditioning a positive emotional response produced by eating to the rabbit. Elements of classical conditioning: neutral stimulus, the white rabbit; unconditioned stimulus, the loud noise; unconditioned response, fear, hadlock; the conditioned stimulus, the white rat; unconditioned response is kahadlok pod. Progression result of experiment: introduction of a loud sound, unconditioned stimulus resulted in fear; unconditioned response, a natural response. Introduction of a rat, neutral stimulus, feared with the loud sound; unconditioned stimulus result in fear and the unconditioned response. Successive introductions of a rat, conditioned response. Here, learning is demonstrated. Aspects of Watson's theory: he opposed mentalistic concepts. He used contiguity to explain learning. He considered emotion to be just another example of classical conditioning. He rejected the notion of individual differences. He thought complex behaviors came about through combinations of identifiable reflexes. He was a sheer proponent of nurture and believed that all human differences were the result of learning. He believed that practice strengthens learning. Implications of Watson's theory: the animal trainers, parents, teachers, and many others make use of basic behavioral principles to help teach new behaviors and discourage unwanted ones. To find out whether the students have better understanding through observing their behavior changes. Sequencing of learning lead to mastery in learning. Use of reinforcement to improve. Positive verbal reinforcement takes little time or effort and usually bring about the desired behavior quickly. Treating various behavioral and psychological problems like phobia and anxiety. Immediate, consistent, and positive reinforcement increases the speed of learning as well as intermittent reinforcement promotes retention of the learned behavior. Habits and other undesirable responses can be broken by removing the positive reinforcers connected with them. Critiques of John Watson theory. Thomson attaches more importance to the law of effect than to the law of exercise and frequency. He points out that there is no guarantee in favor of the successful movement being most frequently repeated or exercised. Even an erroneous movement may go on being repeated. So according to the law of frequency only, it stands a fair chance of being stumped in. This, however, does not occur if the law effect be emphasized. Secondly, if recency alone be the cause of learning, then every prior unsuccessful or erroneous movement being recent would go on being repeated. And there is another author, Ivan Pavlov, Classical Conditioning Theory. The classical conditioning theory is based on the assumption that learning is developed through the interactions with the environment. Also, the environment shapes the behavior and internal mental states such as thoughts, feelings, emotions do not explain the human behavior. It was proposed by a Russian sociologist, Ivan Pavlov. According to this theory, behavior is learned by a repeated associated between the response and the stimulus. Ivan Pavlov is well known for his work in classical conditioning or stimulus substitution. Pavlov was renowned experiment involved meat, a dog, and a bear. Pavlov's experiment. Before conditioning, ringing the bell and neutral stimulus caused no response from the dog. Placing food. Unconditioned stimulus. In front of the dog, initiate salivation. Unconditioned response. During conditioning, the bell was rung a few before the dog was presented with food. After conditioning, the ringing of the bell, conditioned stimulus. Alone procedure salivation and conditioned response. During the experiment of Pavlov while studying the roles of saliva in dog digestive process, Pavlov accidentally discovered the conditioned response. So there is the pictures of before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. Number 1. Food and conditioned stimulus. So the dogs. Makita tas number 1 sa picture, ang iro tagkuanan og taghatagan siya og food. And the number 2 is bell. Pagpatingog siguro ang bell para tawagon siya. Neutral stimulus. And makita sa picture, wala siya naglaway. And number 3, during conditioning, bell and food. Mana ikikuan siya. Ayang response is walang niamo siya na naglaway. And number 4, after conditioning, bell conditioned stimulus. Response mara gihapon. The elements of classical conditioning. Stimulus, something that exists in the surrounding or that is pretended. And response, how the animal responds to the certain stimulus. And number 1, unconditioned stimulus, unconditionally, naturally, and automatically triggers a response. Number 2, unconditioned responses, unlearned response that occurs naturally in response to the conditioned stimulus. Number 3, conditioned stimulus, Previously neutral stimulus that after becoming associated with the unconditioned stimulus eventually comes to trigger a conditioned response. And number 4, conditioned response, learned response to the previously neutral stimulus. Pavlov's some findings. Number 1, stimulus generalization. Once the dog has learned to salivate at the sound of the bell, it will salivate of other similar sounds. Number 2, extensions. If you stop pairing the bell with foods, salivation will eventually case in response to the bell. So pag ihunong daw nimo patingog ang bell na naay food, maglaway ra gihapon ng iro. Mora yung response. So number 3, spontaneous recovery. Extinguished responses can be recovered after an elapsed time, but will soon extinguish again if the dog is not presented with food. Number 4, discrimination. The dog could learn to discriminate between similar bells and discern which bell with food. Another unconditioned to associate the bell would result in the presentation of food and which would not. Number 5, higher order conditioning. Once the dog has been conditioned to associate the bell with food, another unconditioned stimulus, such as a light, may be flashed at the same time that the bell is rung. Eventually, the dog will salivate at the flash of the light without the sound of the bell. And another author, Edward Lee Thorndike, was an influential psychologist who is often referred to as the founder of modern educational psychology. He was perhaps best known for his famous puzzle box experiments with cats, which led to the development of his law of effect. Thorndike's principle suggests that response immediately followed by satisfaction will be more likely to recur. The law of effect also suggests that behaviors followed by dissatisfaction or discomfort will become less likely to occur. Edward Thorndike's connectionism theory have as the original SR framework of behavioral psychology. More than 100 years ago, he wrote a textbook entitled, so nagsulat siya daghan na mga textbook, Educational Psychology. He was the first one to use this term. He explained that learning is the result of associations or habits, become strengthened or weakened by the nature and frequency of the SR pairings. The model for SR theory was trial and error learning, in which certain, like all behavioral theory, was that learning could be adequately explained without considering any unobservable internal states. Thorndike's answer to what is learned. Habit learning, reinforcement, stamps, and disconnections. So, ang atong S is habit learning and atong R is reinforcement. Thorndike's theory on connectionism states that learning has taken place when a strong connection or bond between stimulus and response is formed. He came up with 3 primary laws. So there is a 3 primary laws. And the first one is law of effect. The law of effect states that a connection between a stimulus and response is straightened when the consequence is positive, and reward and the connection between the stimulus and the response is weakened when the consequence is negative. So muhina ang response kung negative ang atong consequence. And another is law of exercise. This tells us that the more an SR stimulus response bond is practiced, the stronger it will become. The law of exercise also had to be revised when Thorndike found that practice without feedback does not necessarily enhance performance. And the last one is law of readiness. This states that the more readiness to learning, the learning has to respond to the stimulus. the stronger will be the bond between them. General illustration of the three laws. And the law of effect is nakita na to na gusto siya mukaon og chocolate kapag adlaw-adlaw pa na gustuhon niya. And the law of exercise, kung una siya permi kung nabay gusto niya mag-study ana. And the law of readiness is mag-learn ang mga students hantod sa mag-learn. Principles derived from Thorndike's connectionism. Learning requires both practice and reward. Law of effect or exercise. Number 1. Learning requires both practice and reward. So, this is law of effect and exercise. A series of SR connections can be chained together if they belong to the same action sequence. And the law of readiness. Number 3. Transfer of learning occurs because of the previously encountered situations. And the number 4 is intelligence is a function of the number of connections learned. The author and another author is Borchos Frederick Skinner. Believe in the stimulus response pattern of the conditioned behavior. His theory zeroed in only on changes and observable behavior, excluding any likelihood of any processes taking place in the mind. He wrote Science and Human Behavior, in which he pointed out how the principles of operant conditioning function in social institutions such as government, law, religion, economics, and education. His theory came to be known as operant conditioning. The operant conditioning is based upon the notion that learning is a result of change in overt behavior. Changes in behavior are the result of an individual's response to events, stimuli, that occur in the environment. And the reinforcement is the key element in Skinner's SR theory. A reinforcer is anything that strengthens the desired response. There is a positive reinforcer and a negative reinforcer. The positive reinforcer is any stimulus that is given or added to increase the response. Ang positive reinforcers kuno is nag-add siya or nagadugang og mga responses. Example, a teacher promises extra time in the play area to children who behave well during the lesson. So gibali maghatag siya og reward kung naabay hilom maminaw or magbehave sa iyang klase. Negative reinforcer is any stimulus that results in the increased frequency of a response when it is withdrawn or removed. A negative reinforcer is not a punishment. In fact, it is a reward. And so, the negative reinforcer, dili daw siya is a punish. So, makadawat gyapon ka og reward. Example, a teacher announces that a student who gets an average grade of 1.5 for the 2 grading periods will no longer take the final examination. So, kibali ang estudyante, nakadawat siya or nakakuha siya og grado na 1.5. So, di na niya need mag-take og final examination. And non-reinforcer responses that are not reinforced are not likely to nerve-fitted. Example, ignoring a student's misbehavior may extinguish that behavior. Shaping of behavior. An animal on a cage may take a very long time to figure out that pressing a lever will produce food. To accomplish such behavior, successive approximation of the behavior are rewarded until the animal learns the end and the food reward. Behavioral chaining comes about when a series of steps are needed to be learned. The animals will master each step in sequence until the entire sequence is learned. Reinforcement schedules. Once the desired behavioral response is accomplished, Reinforcement does not have to be 100%. In fact, it can be maintained more successfully through what Skinner referred to as partial reinforcement schedules. Fixed interval schedules. The target response is reinforced after a fixed amount of time has passed since the last reinforcement. Variable interval schedules. This is similar to fixed interval schedules, but the amount of time that must pass between reinforcement varies. Fixed ratio schedules. A fixed number of correct responses must occur before reinforcement may recur. The variable ratio schedules. The number of correct repetitions of the correct response for reinforcement varies. Implications of operant conditioning. These implications are given for program instruction. Practice. Number 1. Practice should take the form of questions, stimulus, answer, and response frames which expose the student to the subject in gradual steps. Number 2. Require that the learning makes response for every frame and receives immediate feedback. Number 3. Try to arrange the difficulty of the questions so the response is always correct and hence a positive reinforcement. Number 4. Ensure that good performance in the lesson is paired with secondary reinforcers such as verbal, prizes, and good grades. Principles derived from Skinner's operant conditioning. Number 1. Behavior that is positively reinforced will reoccur. Intermittent reinforcement is particularly effective. Number 2. Information should be presented in small amounts so that responses can be reinforced. Shaping. Number 3. Reinforcement will generalize across similar stimuli. Stimulus generation, producing secondary conditioning.